All right, strap yourselves in because today we are going deep into the world of remote viewing.
Ooh, exciting.
It's a fascinating one. Basically, the idea is that you could, well, kind of become a psychic spy.
Right. So gather information about a place or an object just using your mind. No technology needed.
Yeah, exactly. So forget your fancy gadgets. This is all about mental power, right?
Exactly. Pure mind power.
To guide our deep dive today, we're going to be using the Wikipedia article on remote viewing.
A classic.
A classic. And a really good starting point, I think, to kind of unpack all of this.
Yeah, I think it's a good foundation because there's a lot to unpack.
There is.
And it is also a very controversial subject.
Yeah.
Because despite, all the talk and the decades of research on it, most scientists remain, well, unconvinced.
Yeah.
They say there's just no hard evidence to back up these pretty wild claims.
That's right. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, as they say. So before we get into the evidence, or lack thereof, maybe we should start with where this whole concept even came from.
Yeah, good point. I mean, it's not like somebody just woke up one day and said, hey, I think I can spy with my mind.
Haha, right.
Well, actually, the roots of remote viewing go way back, further than the term itself.
Oh, but...
We're talking like mid-1800s, a time when the lines between science and spiritualism, weren't as clear as they are now.
Yeah.
So think seances, traveling clairvoyance,
right.
All of these terms that kind of describe essentially what we call now remote viewing.
So less lab coats and more crystal balls.
Pretty much. But even back then, the mainstream scientific community, they were already raising their eyebrows a little bit.
Sure.
Pretty big names like Michael Faraday,
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
And Alfred Russel Wallace.
Wow, giants in their fields.
Yeah, they were, big names in physics and natural history. And they dabbled in these paranormal investigations.
Yeah.
But even their efforts, they were often met with skepticism from their peers.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, why did this idea persist even with, all this scientific pushback?
It's a good question. Well, if we fast forward to the 1960s, you've got the counterculture movement sort of exploding onto the scene.
Right.
And suddenly there's this whole renewed interest in, things like ESP, altered states of consciousness, anything that, kind of challenge conventional thinking.
So do you think remote viewing kind of rode that wave of fascination with the paranormal?
Exactly. And then in the 1970s, two physicists at the Stanford Research Institute, Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ,
Okay.
they really took the research to a whole new level.
So they were kind of the pioneers of the modern, research into remote viewing.
Pretty much. They coined the term remote viewing, and they conducted some of the first, controlled experiments in the field.
Oh, wow. And so their research, although controversial, caught the attention of...
Well, the U.S. government...
Okay, hold on. The government got involved in this.
Oh, yeah. Things are about to get interesting.
Things just got a whole lot more interesting.
Here's where we get into the Stargate project.
Yeah.
This was a top-secret government program that launched in the 1970s.
Oh, wow.
And their goal was to use remote viewing for intelligence gathering.
Wait, so we're talking psychic spies trying to, get intel on the Soviets or something?
You got it. The Cold War was in full swing.
Right.
And the idea of, psychically spying on the enemy must have seemed like a total game changer.
Yeah.
So they poured millions of dollars into this program, ran it for 2 decades, from 1975 to 1995.
Wow.
Wow.
So did they manage to, unearth three state secrets with their psychic spy program?
Well, not really. That's where the story takes a turn, and not a good one if you're a believer in remote viewing.
Oh, okay.
Despite, years of effort and a lot of money, the Stargate project was shut down in 1995.
Mm-hmm.
The CIA basically concluded that it didn't work. They said it failed to produce any real actionable intelligence. They deemed it unreliable.
So even with all that money and all that time, the government just couldn't make psychic spies a reality.
Nope. And, that failure, it really fueled skepticism.
Sure.
If a well-funded government program can't prove it, then what hope is there?
Right.
So it led to a lot more scrutiny.
Yeah. So it seems like the Stargate project's demise was a major turning point in the conversation about remote viewing, kind of shifting it more towards the criticism and the doubt.
Definitely. But even before Stargate folded, there were scientists who were already pointing out some pretty serious flaws
Yay.
in the research methods being used.
Okay, so let's dive into that a bit. What kind of flaws are we talking about here?
Well, one of the biggest criticisms was the issue of sensory cues.
Okay.
So imagine a remote viewer is trying to describe a hidden target, right? What if there were subtle clues, even unintentional ones, in the experimental setup or in the materials, And those cues could then, unknowingly influence the viewer's perceptions.
So it's kind of like accidentally giving away the answer without realizing it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, some of the scientists who were first to raise these concerns, C.E.M. Hansel, David Marks, and Richard Kamen, they analyzed, several prominent remote viewing studies and argued that, a lot of these seemingly impressive results, they could be explained by unintentional cues or biases in the experimental design.
You have any examples of how that might happen?
Sure. So imagine the target material has, a date on it or a timestamp.
Right.
And the viewer might subconsciously pick up on that. And then they might incorporate that into their description.
Yeah.
So it seems like they're getting accurate information psychically.
Right.
But actually, they're just making deductions based on these little cues.
So like those guess the card magic tricks where the magician is kind of subtly leading you to the right answer.
Exactly.
Okay.
If those cues aren't carefully controlled it can really skew the results of an experiment. And it can make it look like, something paranormal is happening when it's really just good old-fashioned observation and deduction.
Right. So basically, these early experiments may not have been as, quote, psychic as they first appeared.
Yeah, that's a key argument from the skeptics.
Okay.
And, as research methods became more rigorous, many of those early positive results, they couldn't be replicated.
Interesting.
Which further fueled the debate, of course.
Yeah, so it sounds like things were getting pretty heated between the believers and the skeptics. Were there some, big names in the skeptical community that really took aim at remote viewing?
Oh, absolutely. One of the most prominent was James Randi.
Okay.
He was a magician and a well-known debunker of paranormal claims.
Yeah, I've heard of him.
Yeah. And, he was famous for offering this huge cash prize to anyone who can prove they had genuine psychic powers.
I think it was $1 million, right?
$1 million. That's right. To anyone who could demonstrate paranormal abilities under, controlled conditions.
Oh.
And guess what? Nobody ever claimed that prize.
$1 million. That's a pretty serious statement, I think, about his confidence in debunking these claims. What kind of methods did he use?
So he was all about designing these, foolproof tests, eliminating any possibility of trickery or subconscious cues. So he used double-blind protocols, where neither the experimenters nor the subjects knew the target in advance.
Right.
And he carefully controlled for, any potential sources of bias.
So he was basically saying, if you can prove it under these really strict conditions, the money is yours. Yeah. And nobody could.
Nobody could.
Oh, yeah.
And, his work, along with other skeptics, it really chipped away at the credibility of remote viewing.
So we have a government program that, despite a lot of time and money, couldn't find any real-world applications for it. We have scientists pointing out potential flaws in the research. We have skeptics like James Randi debunking claims left and right. It's starting to sound like remote viewing might just be wishful thinking, no matter how intriguing the concept is.
Well, that is the prevailing view in the scientific community.
Okay.
But of course, there are still people who believe in it.
Yeah.
And they continue to research.
Of course, and we'll get to that. But it sounds like, the burden of proof is really on those who believe in remote viewing to provide some more solid evidence.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where we'll pick things up in the next part of our deep dive. We'll explore some of the research that claims to support remote viewing.
Okay.
And we'll look at the arguments made by those who believe it's a real phenomenon.
Okay.
We'll even delve into some of the potential implications of remote viewing if it were indeed real.
That should be interesting.
Yeah, I think it's going to be fascinating.
I'm already intrigued. So for our listeners out there, get ready for part 2, where we're going to continue to kind of unravel the mysteries of remote viewing.
Welcome back. So, last time, things weren't looking so good for remote viewing.
Right.
With all that evidence stacked against it.
Yeah, it's pretty damning.
But it's rarely that simple, is it?
That's right. Right. There's always, different perspectives, different interpretations.
Right.
So what about the people who still believe in it?
Yeah.
What evidence are they looking at? What are they pointing to?
Well, despite all the criticisms, research into remote viewing actually continued, often outside of, those mainstream scientific institutions.
Right.
And one organization that really pushed the field forward was the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab.
Okay.
Or PEER for short.
PEER, okay.
And this ran from the late 1970s all the way to 2007.
PEER, I have heard that name before, kind of in discussions about parapsychology and stuff.
Yeah.
What kind of research were they doing?
So they were dedicated to studying what they called human-machine anomalies.
Okay.
Which, included things like psychokinesis, so the ability to influence physical objects with the mind.
Right.
And, of course, remote viewing.
Of course, yeah.
And they conducted a ton of experiments over several decades, often using, pretty sophisticated statistical analysis to evaluate their results.
So they were really trying to bring like a rigorous quantitative approach to studying this?
Exactly.
Okay.
They argued that their methods, were specifically designed to address some of those criticisms we talked about.
Like the sensory cues and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Like sensory cues and experimenter bias.
Oh, okay.
And they said they found statistically significant results.
Okay, so they're finding positive results. But how did the, wider scientific community react to all this?
Well, it was a mixed bag, as you might imagine. Right. Some researchers, particularly in the field of parapsychology, they found the methods and results compelling. But a lot of the mainstream scientists, they remain skeptical.
So even within the world of, paranormal research and parapsychology, there's still debate and disagreement.
Yeah, it's not like a monolithic community or anything.
Right.
There are different schools of thought, different methodologies, different ways of interpreting data. Even among those who, are open to the possibility of psi phenomena.
Right.
There's no one, universally accepted explanation for how remote viewing might work.
Okay, so what were some of the specific criticisms of PEER's research then?
Well, one criticism focused on their statistical methods. Some critics argued that even if the results were, statistically insignificant, the effects were often very small.
Okay.
So meaning the actual impact of the phenomenon, if it's real, might be tiny, almost negligible.
Yeah. So it's like finding a statistically significant correlation between, like eating ice cream and getting a sunburn. Like, sure, there might be a link, but it's probably because of other factors, like summertime, right?
Exactly, yeah. And another criticism was that PEER's experiments, while they were more rigorous than some of the earlier studies,
right,
they still weren't completely immune to those potential biases or methodological flaws.
Yeah, it sounds like it's incredibly difficult to design like a truly foolproof remote viewing experiment.
Yeah.
But let's kind of shift gears for a second.
Okay.
What about the people who, claim to have personally experienced remote viewing?
Yeah, that anecdotal evidence.
Right.
Always a tricky one, right?
It is.
Because those personal experiences, while compelling, they don't really meet the standards of scientific evidence.
Right.
Because our memories, our perceptions can be influenced by so many things.
Emotions and expectations.
Yeah, emotions, expectations, and even, just our desire to believe something.
Right.
There's that famous Carl Sagan quote, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Well, right.
And when it comes to claims as extraordinary as remote viewing, personal anecdotes, they just don't cut it.
But there were people who, participated in the Stargate project, like Ingo Swann or Pat Price.
Yeah.
They claim to have some pretty remarkable successes.
They did, yeah. Their stories are definitely intriguing.
Yeah.
But even those who, really believe in remote viewing, they acknowledge that these individual experiences have to be interpreted very carefully.
Right.
It's possible that what they perceived as psychic abilities were actually a combination of factors like, maybe intuition, maybe really good observation skills,
right,
maybe even a little bit of luck.
So it's kind of like a detective trying to piece together a really complex puzzle, right?
Yeah.
There might be clues that seem to point in one direction, but without the full picture, it's really hard to know what actually happened.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And, it's why scientists always emphasize the importance of controlled experiments and replicable results.
Right.
We need a way to separate genuine phenomena from chance occurrences, from perceptual biases, or even, outright fraud in some cases.
So where does all of this leave us? We have some research suggesting it might be possible, but there are also these valid criticisms and this lack of, conclusive proof. It's a bit of a head scratcher.
It is. And it leads to this question that's, I think, almost as much philosophical as it is scientific.
Oh.
Even if we could definitively prove, without a shadow of a doubt, that remote viewing exists, how would we explain it?
Yeah, right.
What mechanisms could possibly allow, information to be transferred across vast distances without any known physical means?
It's a huge question. And it feels like, with our current understanding of physics, there's not really a good explanation for how that would work.
Right. Exactly. And, that's why a lot of scientists remain very, very skeptical.
Right.
Some people suggest that if it were real, it would require us to completely rethink our understanding of the universe.
Wow.
And the laws of physics.
Yeah. So it's not just a challenge to prove that it happens, but also to even figure out how it could be possible, with what we know right now.
That's exactly it. That's the core of the issue, I think. And it's why this debate continues to fascinate.
Yeah.
And also frustrate in equal measure.
Right, right. So, okay, we've explored, the arguments for and against it. We've looked at the research. We've talked about philosophical implications. I feel like there's one big question we haven't really talked about.
Oh, what's that?
What if, just for a moment, we entertain the possibility that it is real?
Oh, okay.
Like, what would that mean for us as a society,
Yeah.
What are the potential consequences,
right,
the good and the bad, of having this ability?
Yeah, now that is a good question.
Yeah.
A conversation worth having. And that's what we're going to dive into in the final part
of
this deep dive.
All right.
We'll explore the potential applications of remote viewing and some of the ethical considerations that come with it.
Sounds good. I am ready. All right, so we spent the last 2 parts. I don't know about you, but I feel like I've been wading through mud.
Yeah.
With all this remote viewing research.
That's a lot to take in.
Yeah, the claims and the counterclaims, and, we've looked at all of it.
Right.
But now comes the fun part, I think.
Okay, the fun part.
The what if.
Okay.
What if, despite all, the lack of evidence and all of the criticism, what if it is real?
Yeah, what's a if?
What would the implications be of a world where, essentially our minds can kind of transcend space and time to gather information?
It really is like opening Pandora's box.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
On the one hand, you can imagine some really amazing positive applications for this.
Oh, for sure, yeah. Like locating missing persons, maybe even predicting natural disasters.
Yeah. What about uncovering historical mysteries?
Oh, yeah.
Right. Like getting a glimpse into events that we thought were lost to time.
Yeah, it'd revolutionize archaeology, intelligence gathering, even law enforcement.
Yeah.
It's like having a sixth sense,
Yeah.
Like a way to tap into information that's right now completely beyond our reach.
But, with every positive possibility, there's also, of course, the flip side.
Of course, right. We can't just focus on the good without thinking about the potentially negative consequences.
Exactly.
Right.
So imagine governments or corporations using this for espionage.
Right.
Or surveillance. Even manipulating people's thoughts and actions.
It's a chilling thought. Suddenly privacy, like true privacy, is gone.
Doesn't exist anymore.
It's like something out of a dystopian novel, like everybody's constantly being watched.
Right, yeah. Big Brother.
Yeah. And their thoughts are no longer their own.
Exactly. So it raises all these, huge ethical questions like, who would have access to this? How would it be regulated?
Yeah.
What safeguards would be in place to prevent abuse?
Yeah, it really does make you wonder, is this a Pandora's box that we even want to open?
Yeah.
Even if we could.
Right.
Because it's a reminder that even, these fantastical, far out kind of sci-fi ideas can have very real world consequences.
Definitely.
And potentially very dangerous ones as well.
And, it's important to remember we are still very much in the realm of hypotheticals here.
Of course, yeah.
The scientific community is still largely unconvinced about, the validity of all of this.
And for good reason.
And for good reason, yeah. The evidence isn't really there.
But I think that's part of what makes it so interesting to talk about.
Yeah, for sure.
It makes us think beyond what we think we know about the world.
Yeah, it pushes the boundaries.
Yeah, to kind of explore these possibilities.
Definitely. It forces us to confront the limitations of our knowledge.
Yeah.
And to acknowledge that there are still a lot of mysteries out there, things we just don't understand.
Yeah. And maybe that's a good thing.
Yeah.
To have these unanswered questions.
It keeps us curious.
Yeah, it keeps us curious. It keeps us asking questions, keeps us searching for answers.
Exactly. It's a reminder that, the pursuit of knowledge is a journey, not a destination.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said.
And sometimes the most interesting questions are the ones that don't have easy answers.
So, wherever you fall in this whole debate, whether you're true believer, a staunch skeptic, or somewhere in between, I hope this deep dive into remote viewing has, given you something to think about.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a topic worth pondering.
Yeah. The idea of perceiving things beyond our senses, it's alluring for sure.
It's a very attractive idea.
But the evidence just isn't there.
Not yet, anyway.
Right. Not yet. So I think the takeaway here is that, we can explore these ideas, we can have fun with them, we can speculate, but ultimately we have to kind of ground ourselves in the evidence and in critical thinking.
Right. That's how we move forward.
Yeah, well said. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of remote viewing. Keep those minds open, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you for joining CMF Conspiracies podcast. What do you think about the topic we covered today? Comment below with your thoughts on this subject. If you have a conspiracy you wish for us to deep dive into, please send your topic to our email address or leave it in the comments. Thank you again for watching. Like and subscribe for more content like this.